History. If I told you that the United States of America, the world's most powerful democracy today, was not born from guns, not from a throne, and not only from battles, but from words, would you believe it? That's right, just words. Words written on a fragile piece of parchment more than 2 centuries ago. Words so dangerous and bold that signing them was no different from signing one's own death warrant. If the revolution failed, they would never be remembered as heroes, but as traitors, hunted, captured, and executed by the British Crown. Yet they still picked up the pen and wrote. The surprise lies in the fact that those words were not simply a declaration of separation. They gave birth to an entirely new way of thinking about power, about human rights, and about the nature of government itself. They were not just a list of grievances sent to King George III, but a proclamation to the entire world that ordinary people, not kings, not nobles, not bloodlines, were the true source of power. Just imagine, in 1776, the idea that all men are created equal was utterly shocking. Across Europe, thrones and dynasties reigned. Empires stretched across continents. Yet a group of lawyers, farmers, and merchants in the American colonies dared to assert that the people, not any king, were the rightful masters of a nation. But that was only the beginning, because winning independence was hard. Keeping it was even harder. The Declaration of Independence was like the first spark lighting the dream of liberty, but the Constitution was the hearth that kept that flame alive. Without the Constitution, the young United States might have collapsed from the start, sinking into chaos from weak laws, divided states, and politics full of mistrust. The dream of freedom could have died out before it ever had the chance to shine. The question is, how did 2 documents, one a Declaration of Liberty, the other a blueprint of government, not only survive, but shape the destiny of an entire people? Why, more than 200 years later, do people still argue over them, quote them, even sacrifice their lives to defend the principles within? And here's something even more shocking. Do the principles of 1776 and 1787 still have the strength to guide us in the 21st century, a world of digital technology, artificial intelligence, and global superpowers? Or is it time for a new declaration and a new constitution for today's age? In this video, we won't just reread those old lines written in faded ink. We will peel back layers of history, uncovering the struggles, the betrayals, and the daring decisions that gave them life. You will see how a group of people in Philadelphia changed human history, and why the echoes of their choices still shape your life today. Before we begin, I want to ask you, do you believe that words can be more powerful than weapons? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you love exploring dramatic stories from history, often more shocking than anything textbooks ever told, hit subscribe to U.S. History right now and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single story. Today, we're not just telling the story of America's past, we're decoding the secret foundation of freedom. In the latter half of the 18th century, the American colonies under British rule were gradually becoming a land of unrest. The 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast, originally formed by groups of migrants seeking religious freedom, economic opportunity, and escape from European oppression, now found themselves in a new stranglehold under the rule of the British Empire. At that time, Britain was one of the most powerful nations in the world, with a nearly invincible navy and a vast trade network spanning continents. To the British rulers, the American colonies were nothing more than sources of economic and military profit. They imposed harsh taxes and strict trade controls to extract every bit of resource and wealth from this distant land. The colonists increasingly felt that they were no longer treated as free citizens, but rather as people being exploited. A series of taxes passed by the British Parliament triggered waves of fierce opposition.
The Stamp Act of 1765 taxed all papers, contracts, newspapers, even sermons in churches. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed import duties on many essential goods. Most notably, the Tea Act of 1773 became the last straw, allowing the East India Company to monopolize tea sales at low prices but with mandatory taxes, angering colonists who felt forced to pay for an unjust policy. The famous slogan, "No taxation without representation," rang throughout the colonies. People believed that without representation in the British Parliament, no one had the right to tax them. This slogan became a direct challenge to royal authority and expressed the yearning for self-determination. Resistance spread wider and wider, exemplified by the Boston Tea Party in December 1773. A group of colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British tea ships in Boston Harbor and dumped all the cargo into the sea. That daring act was not only a protest against taxes, but also a declaration that the people were ready to challenge the mightiest empire of the age. Britain's response was extremely harsh. They imposed what became known as the Coercive Acts, or Intolerable Acts, in 1774, closing Boston Harbor, stripping Massachusetts of many self-governing rights, and reinforcing military presence. Instead of being subdued, the colonists grew even more united. For the first time, representatives from the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia in September 1774 at what became the Continental Congress. They discussed ways to resist, debated boycotting British goods, and explored options to defend their rights. Though many still hoped for reconciliation, the seeds of independence had begun to take root. In 1775, armed conflict broke out at Lexington and Concord, marking the start of the Revolutionary War. The colonial army was young, poorly equipped, and inexperienced, but their spirit blazed with determination. George Washington was chosen as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. While battles raged, the leaders continued to meet and deliberate over the political future. They knew the war could not drag on indefinitely, and that a formal declaration was necessary both to legitimize their cause and to gain international support, especially from France and Spain. In June 1776, the Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft an official declaration. 5 members were chosen: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Among them, Thomas Jefferson, a young lawyer from Virginia, was entrusted with writing the draft. Jefferson possessed sharp reasoning, eloquent writing, and a firm belief in natural human rights. It took him only a few days to compose the document that would become one of the most influential texts in human history. Jefferson's draft began with immortal words: "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments are instituted to protect these rights, and if a government becomes tyrannical, the people have the right to overthrow it and establish a new one." This was not merely an indictment of King George III, but a bold political philosophy challenging every traditional concept of power. When Jefferson presented his draft to Congress, heated debates followed. Some members wanted to revise the wording to fit practical realities. In particular, the section condemning slavery was removed to avoid dividing the northern and southern colonies. Even so, the core spirit remained intact. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence. That day, a new nation was born, at least on paper. But imagine the feelings of those who signed it. They knew well that they were defying the world's greatest empire. They knew that if they failed, their property would be seized, their families endangered, and they themselves would be hanged. Yet in that historic moment, they chose to place their trust in liberty and in the future of humanity. News of the Declaration spread rapidly throughout the colonies. In towns, copies were read aloud before crowds. Cheers erupted. Effigies of King George were burned, his statue in New York pulled down. For the first time, people no longer saw themselves as British subjects, but as citizens of a new nation, the United States of America. But the harsh truth was that the Declaration was only the beginning. On the battlefield, American forces faced Britain's seasoned army. The war dragged on for 7 long years, full of hardship and sacrifice. But the spirit of the Declaration became a torch of guidance, fueling both soldiers and citizens. It was not just a political document, it was the soul of a revolution. What's remarkable is that the Declaration of Independence influenced far beyond America. When its words reached Europe, they shook the very foundations of monarchies. The French, just over a decade later, rose in the Revolution of 1789, partly inspired by the American spirit. Across Latin America, independence movements followed this model. That a small group of colonies dared challenge the greatest empire and succeeded proved that freedom was not just a dream, but something attainable. For Americans, the Declaration of Independence is not merely a legal document. It has become the symbol of the nation's ideals. Every generation since has looked back to it as a mirror, asking whether America has drawn closer or strayed from its original promises. When Abraham Lincoln stood at Gettysburg during the Civil War, he echoed the words of equality from 1776. When Martin Luther King raised his voice in the Civil Rights Movement, he too invoked the Declaration as an unfulfilled check for Black Americans. Thus, the power of the Declaration of Independence lies not in being a text of the past, but in how it continues to speak to the present and the future. It poses the question to every generation: do we truly regard all people as equal, or are there still barriers left to overcome? It is a reminder that freedom is never something merely given. It must always be defended and fought for.
When the last guns of the Revolutionary War fell silent, and the Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially recognized the independence of the United States, many believed that all hardships had ended. Americans at that time rejoiced in a victory that had once seemed impossible against one of the world's greatest empires. They sang in the streets, raised toasts in taverns, and looked to the future with confidence that freedom was finally theirs. But very quickly, that joy gave way to an anxious question. Freedom had been won, but who would preserve it? How could such a vast, diverse, and still fragile nation like the United States be governed? Americans had fought for the idea of liberty, but now they had to find a way to make that idea a reality. Before the Constitution, this new nation was governed under a document called the Articles of Confederation, the first federal charter. It was an agreement drafted by the states in 1777 and put into effect in 1781, while the War for Independence was still underway. The Articles of Confederation reflected the deep fear Americans had of centralized power. After years of enduring the distant rule of the British Parliament and the harsh laws of King George III, they wanted no strong central government that could oppress and strip them of liberty again. So the Articles created an extremely weak system, in which the states held nearly all the power, and the central government existed only as a shadow. Under this system, the Continental Congress became a federal Congress, but there was no president to lead, no true executive branch to enforce laws, and no federal court system to resolve disputes. Congress could pass resolutions, but had no power to compel the states to obey. They could request funds, but had no authority to tax. They could call for troops, but had no right to maintain a standing army. Real power remained with the states, and to approve any major decision required the consent of 9 out of 13 states, a ratio that made governing nearly impossible. At first, this model seemed reasonable. Americans only wanted to escape the chains of tyranny and allow the states to govern themselves. But when the war ended, the deadly flaws of the Articles became clear. America sank into economic chaos. Congress could not impose taxes,
so it had no funds to pay off war debts. Soldiers who had fought bravely for years returned home with nothing but promissory notes that were never redeemed. The states freely printed their own currencies, leading to worthless money and rampant inflation. Trade between states became a mess, as there were no federal laws to regulate it. Each state imposed its own tariffs and rules, sparking endless disputes. It was not only the economy, politics too fell into crisis. People began to realize that a weak government did not equal a free society. Instead, central weakness endangered security and order. In 1786, frustration exploded into a major event known as Shays' Rebellion. It was an uprising of thousands of farmers in Massachusetts, led by a former officer named Daniel Shays. After the war, many farmers had sunk deep into debt. State courts seized their lands and property for unpaid loans. Meanwhile, the central government was too weak to intervene or provide relief. Out of anger, the farmers took up arms. They surrounded courthouses to stop judges from issuing foreclosures. They clashed with local militias. At the peak, thousands marched to seize the federal arsenal in Springfield. Shays' Rebellion shocked the entire nation. Many American leaders feared that if the central government could not maintain order, the country could collapse from within. George Washington, retired after victory, was forced to declare that America was in danger of losing the fruits of its revolution. Thomas Jefferson, hearing of the rebellion from France, remained calm, saying that occasional uprisings were necessary to keep government from becoming tyrannical. But most leaders, especially those who saw the chaos firsthand, understood that the situation was too grave to ignore. It demanded sweeping change. The problem was not only about economics or security. It raised a fundamental question. Could liberty survive without a government strong enough to protect it? A government too weak could not stop riots, defend borders, or uphold faith in law. But a government too strong risked becoming the very tyranny Americans had once despised. Finding the balance between freedom and power became a matter of survival. It was from the failures of the Articles of Confederation that American leaders realized a new system was necessary. Secret meetings began to be held, discussing the possibility of rewriting the nation's entire framework. By 1787, the calls for change were never louder. Citizens wanted stability. Merchants wanted uniform trade laws for commerce. Veterans wanted proper compensation for their sacrifices. States wanted a union strong enough to defend the nation against foreign threats. In 1787, the Federal Congress agreed to convene a special convention in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. But many delegates knew they were not there to simply revise. They came to design a new system, a new covenant between government and the people. The struggle to govern the newly free nation was opening a new chapter, and that chapter would lead to the birth of the United States Constitution, a document that not only saved the nation from collapse, but also became the foundation of the oldest continuous democracy in the world.
In 1883, the War for Independence had ended. The Treaty of Paris was signed, recognizing the independence of the United States of America. The Americans had defeated the British Empire, but now a new challenge began. A young nation needed a solid foundation to survive. And that foundation was not the army, nor merely victories on the battlefield, but a legal framework and a government strong enough to sustain freedom. In the early years after independence, the United States operated under the Articles of Confederation. This was the first charter, but it had too many limitations. The central government had almost no real power. It could not levy taxes directly from the people. It could not maintain a standing army. It also could not control commerce between the states. Each state acted almost like a separate nation. The result was economic chaos. Many states printed their own money, causing inflation. War debts could not be paid on time. People grew discontent.
Then, in 1786, in Massachusetts, an event shook the entire country. It was the uprising of poor farmers, known as Shays' Rebellion. They opposed taxes and the state government, gathering in arms to seize courthouses. The central government could do nothing to suppress it. Only local militia forces managed to restore order. This event shocked the leadership. They realized that the young republic was standing on the brink of collapse, not from foreign invasion, but from internal weakness. A great question arose. How could freedom be preserved when the government was too weak to protect it? In May 1787, delegates from 12 states, except Rhode Island, gathered in Philadelphia. They attended a convention with the initial goal of amending the Articles of Confederation. But very soon, many of them realized that amendments were not enough. They needed an entirely new constitution, a legal framework strong enough to hold the Union together, yet flexible enough to protect individual liberty. George Washington, the hero of the Revolution, was chosen as the presiding officer. His presence brought authority and unity. Inside the sweltering hall of the Pennsylvania State House, later known as Independence Hall, fierce debates took place for months. James Madison of Virginia played a prominent role. He is regarded as the father of the Constitution. Madison had carefully studied systems of government from ancient to modern times. He brought forward the Virginia Plan, proposing a strong federal government with 3 branches of power: legislative, executive, and judicial. This idea became the foundation of the entire Constitution. Alexander Hamilton of New York went even further. He believed the central government needed very large powers, almost resembling a monarchy. Many thought Hamilton was too extreme, but his arguments pushed the debates to greater depth. Benjamin Franklin, already over 80 years old, served as a mediator. He used his prestige and wisdom to ease disagreements. Franklin understood that without unity among the states, the republic would collapse. The major debates revolved around 3 main issues. The first issue was the balance of power between large states and small states. Large states like Virginia wanted representation based on population. Small states like New Jersey wanted equal votes for each state. After much dispute, a historic compromise emerged. The House of Representatives would be divided by population. The Senate would have 2 representatives for each state, large or small. This was called the Great Compromise. The second issue was the power of the federal government. Many delegates feared that if the government was too strong, it would become a new king. But if too weak, America would fall into chaos. Eventually, they agreed to establish a system of separation of powers. The government would be divided into 3 branches. Congress would hold legislative power, the President would hold executive power, the Supreme Court would hold judicial power. These 3 branches would check and balance each other. This was an innovation unprecedented in political history. The third issue was slavery. This was a stain of the era. Southern states relied heavily on slavery, while many northern delegates opposed it. In the end, a bitter compromise was reached. Each enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a person when calculating population for congressional representation. This 3/5 compromise was accepted to keep the Union intact, but left a painful legacy for the future. In addition, the Constitution established the election of the President through the Electoral College. This was an intermediate system designed to balance between direct choice by the people and state influence. Throughout the hot summer of 1787, delegates debated, drafted, and debated again. Finally, on September 17, 1787, the United States Constitution was signed. But the work did not stop there. To take effect, the Constitution needed ratification by at least 9 of the 13 states. A nationwide war of words broke out. Supporters of the Constitution, called Federalists, argued that a strong government was needed to protect liberty. Opponents, called Anti-Federalists, feared the new government would become a dictatorship. To persuade the public, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote a series of famous essays known as the Federalist Papers. These writings analyzed in detail why the Constitution was necessary and how it could balance power to prevent abuse. They are considered one of the greatest political works in American history. Finally, after months of debate, the states gradually ratified. In June 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to agree, and the Constitution officially took effect. A new government was born, laying the foundation for the American Republic that endures to this day. However, the concerns of the Anti-Federalists also led to an important outcome. They demanded the addition of individual rights to the Constitution. As a result, a few years later, the first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were adopted, guaranteeing freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the right to a fair trial, and many other basic rights. The creation of the United States Constitution was a difficult journey. It showed that freedom cannot exist without a solid legal order. It also showed that compromise, though hard and sometimes painful, is essential to preserve a union. Today, the U.S. Constitution is regarded as the oldest written constitution still in effect. It has become a model for many other nations around the world. But more importantly, it proves a simple truth. The strength of a nation does not come only from armies or wealth, but from the legal principles that everyone respects together.
After the United States Constitution was signed in 1787, it seemed that everything was complete. But no, fierce debates still continued. Many citizens and political leaders feared that the new Constitution had granted too much power to the federal government. They remembered recent history. Americans had once risen up against King George III of Britain because of his authoritarian rule. So was there a risk that the new government in the United States would become another king? The opponents of the Constitution, called Anti-Federalists, voiced this concern. They feared that the federal government could pass laws to suppress freedom, could imprison people without cause, could silence the press, could seize property, and even trample on the right to live. To them, the independence Americans had just won with blood and sacrifice would become meaningless if the Constitution did not clearly guarantee the freedoms of every individual. Meanwhile, the Federalists, those who supported the Constitution, argued that the Constitution was already sufficient to protect the people. They claimed that since the government was divided into branches with a system of checks and balances, it could never become a dictatorship. But to persuade hesitant states, the Federalists had to compromise. They agreed that a Bill of Rights needed to be added. James Madison, then one of the main architects of the Constitution, initially did not believe this was necessary. But he quickly realized that without explicit guarantees of individual freedoms, ratification would be very difficult. Madison sat down, studied, and wrote a series of amendments. Eventually, the first 10 amendments were adopted in 1791, becoming the Bill of Rights. So what does the Bill of Rights include? The First Amendment guarantees 5 basic freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition the government. This is considered the foundation of American democracy. Citizens can speak their minds. The press can expose wrongdoing. Religions can coexist without being imposed. Protests can take place against injustice. And citizens can directly demand the government to change policies. This single amendment alone created a massive difference compared to most other nations in the 18th century. The Second Amendment grants the right to bear arms.
At that time, the people had just gone through a war for independence. They believed that to protect freedom, citizens must have the ability to defend themselves. An armed people would not easily be oppressed by the government or any invader. To this day, this amendment remains highly controversial, but it clearly reflects the mindset of those who lived in an era where the threat of losing freedom was always present. The Third Amendment states that the government cannot force citizens to house soldiers in peacetime. This came from real experiences under British rule. British soldiers would often stay in private homes, eating and living there without permission. Americans considered this a great violation of privacy. Thus, they explicitly banned it in the Constitution. The Fourth Amendment guarantees protection against arbitrary searches and seizures. The government can only act with a court warrant and just cause. This became the foundation for the American concept of privacy. Citizens have the right to live free from unreasonable intrusion by the state. The Fifth Amendment is famous for the phrase, "the right to remain silent." It ensures that no one can be forced to incriminate themselves. No one can be tried twice for the same offense. No one can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This is one of the most frequently cited amendments in the U.S. legal system. The Sixth Amendment expands the rights of defendants in criminal trials. It guarantees the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury. It also ensures the right to confront witnesses and the right to have legal counsel. Through this, American citizens are protected from arbitrary prosecution by the government. The Seventh Amendment extends jury trials to civil cases. This was an important step to ensure that justice applied not only in criminal cases, but also in civil disputes, such as property or contracts. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishments. It also prohibits excessive bail or fines. This is a humanitarian statement, reminding that even criminals deserve to be treated fairly and humanely. The Ninth Amendment declares that the rights listed in the Constitution are not exhaustive. People still have many other rights, even if they are not written down. This is a very important clause because it opens the door for the expansion of civil rights in the future. The 10th Amendment states that all powers not granted to the federal government belong to the states or the people. This was designed to maintain balance between the central government and the states while preserving the spirit of self-governance for the people. The Bill of Rights is not just a list of rights. It is a declaration that government exists to serve the people, not to rule over them. It reflects the core spirit of the American Revolution. A legitimate government must be limited by law and by the will of the people. Since its adoption, the Bill of Rights has served as a shield protecting Americans through countless crises. Courts have relied on it to safeguard freedom of speech during turbulent times. It has protected minority groups from discrimination. It has protected privacy in an age of surveillance technology. It has restrained abuse of power, no matter which party or politician it came from. The Bill of Rights has also inspired many other nations. Constitutions and declarations of human rights around the world have learned from and inherited the principles of these 10 amendments. From the French Revolution to the 20th century human rights movements, the Bill of Rights stands as proof that individual liberty is not just a dream, but can be guaranteed by law. Today, the Bill of Rights remains an inseparable part of American daily life. When an investigative journalist reports on the government, they are exercising freedom of the press. When a group of people protest, they are exercising the right of assembly. When a suspect invokes the right to remain silent, they are relying on the Fifth Amendment. When a court throws out evidence because it was collected illegally, that is the Fourth Amendment at work. More than 2 centuries have passed, but the Bill of Rights remains alive as on the first day. It not only protected the freedoms of the founding generation, but continues to protect the freedoms of every American citizen today.
Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution are not just two legal documents. They are the soul, the backbone, the source of inspiration that built an entire nation. Looking back on more than 2 centuries of history, we can clearly see that those words on paper have transcended time, war, crisis, and even internal struggles to become the foundation of American democracy, as well as a global symbol. Let us begin with the Declaration of Independence. When Thomas Jefferson first put pen to paper, he could not have imagined the power it would unleash. The phrase, "all men are created equal," became a guiding torch, not only for Americans, but for millions of people around the world. In an age when kings and empires ruled, that idea was like a thunderclap in a silent sky, breaking through the silence of oppression and injustice. After America declared independence, this document was not only a proclamation for a new nation, but also a challenge to the entire world. The French, standing at the dawn of their 1789 revolution, drew inspiration from that very spirit. Democratic movements in South America, led by figures like Simón Bolívar, also took inspiration from the flame that had been lit across the Atlantic. Over time, the Declaration of Independence became a global symbol of the desire for freedom, a testament that human rights are not granted by kings or imposed by empires, but are natural rights inherent to every individual. Yet the power of the Declaration would have only been a brief flame if there had not been a house to protect and preserve it, and that is the role of the United States Constitution. When the Constitutional Convention concluded in 1787, the founders laid the foundation for a political system with no precedent. 3 branches of power were created to check and balance one another, preventing any person or institution from holding absolute control. The principle of checks and balances became a pillar, ensuring that freedom would not exist only on paper, but come alive in reality. What is remarkable is that the U.S. Constitution, more than 200 years later, still stands. Nowhere else in the world is there a constitution that has endured so long and with such stability. In more than 2 centuries, only 27 amendments have been passed, a very modest number compared to the massive changes American society has gone through. This shows the strength of a political blueprint that was built so firmly, flexible enough to adapt, yet steadfast enough to preserve its core principles. The Constitution has been tested repeatedly across generations. When the Civil War erupted, it faced the great question of whether the Union could survive such deep division between North and South. When slavery was abolished, the Constitution was amended to affirm that freedom could not coexist with oppression. When women and minorities demanded the right to vote, the Constitution once again extended its embrace, bringing more people into the circle of equal citizenship. Amendments such as the 13th, which abolished slavery, the 19th, which granted women the right to vote, or the 26th, which lowered the voting age to 18, all prove that the Constitution is not closed off. It is like a musical score, capable of adding new melodies while preserving its original spirit. In modern times, the influence of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence is still everywhere. Every major Supreme Court decision, whether ending racial segregation in education, legalizing same-sex marriage, or protecting free speech, traces its roots back to words written more than 2 centuries ago. Each time, Americans are reminded that the Constitution is not some old sheet of paper kept in a museum, but a living document shaping daily life. But the impact does not stop at America's borders. The Declaration and the Constitution have become sources of inspiration for many nations designing their own political systems. From Asia to Africa to Europe, the principles of liberty, equality, and democracy have spread. Each country has its own path, yet the imprint of American ideas can sometimes be seen along the way. Still, there is a great question that many scholars and citizens ask. Do the principles written in the 18th century still hold in the 21st century when the world has changed so profoundly? We live in an age of digital technology.
artificial intelligence, and climate crisis, things the founders could never have imagined. So does the current Constitution have the power to address these challenges? Or does America need a new declaration and Constitution for the modern era? This is precisely what makes the Declaration and the Constitution so special. They do not provide answers to every problem. Instead, they spark debate, raising questions that every generation must face. It is this constant questioning, debating, and adapting that has kept American democracy alive and growing. Today, when we look back, we see that these two documents are both a legacy and a reminder. They remind us that freedom is never freely given, but must be defended and maintained. They also remind us that democracy is not a destination, but a long journey where every citizen carries responsibility. When the Liberty Bell rang in Philadelphia for the first time in 1776, few could have believed its echo would still be heard today. But it is thanks to the power of words, of ideas, and of courage that America has weathered so many storms. The Declaration lit the flame, the Constitution built the house, and together they created the United States we see today. So what about you? Do you believe the principles of 1776 and 1787 still fit the 21st century? Or does humanity need to write a new declaration and constitution suited to the challenges of the digital age? This is an open question, not only for Americans, but for all of us, citizens of a world that changes every day.
Here's the translation of your text into American English, word for word, without adding or removing anything. Now we have gone through a long journey, from the colonial days still under the grip of the British Empire, to the explosive moment of the Declaration of Independence, and then the building of the Constitution, creating a solid framework for a young nation. Those two documents are not just papers. They are the soul, the voice, the flame that lit a new era. The Declaration of Independence is like a torch. It blazed fiercely, illuminating the road of freedom. The Constitution is like a house. It lays the foundation, builds the walls, and gives the people a sturdy roof so that freedom can exist, grow, and be passed on through many generations. Imagine again the moment of the summer of 1776. A group of men, just over 50 people, sitting in the hall in Philadelphia. They trembled as they signed the document, not because of the sweltering heat, but because they knew that signature could be the ticket leading them to the gallows. But they still signed, because they believed that there are values greater than life itself. They believed that all people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence not only declared the birth of a nation, it also sent a powerful message to the whole world that people can stand up, break free from the chains of monarchy, to decide their own destiny. Those words echoed across Europe, Latin America, and continued to inspire millions of people for centuries. But freedom is not just a moment. Freedom needs structure to be protected. When the war for independence ended, the founders of the United States faced a new question: how to preserve freedom without falling into chaos. Because without a government strong enough, everything would collapse from within. And so, the Constitution was born. The Constitution is not perfect. It was born amid fierce debates. There were painful compromises, especially on the issue of slavery. But that was also proof of the pragmatism, the patience, and the foresight of the founders. They knew that a nation could only exist if there was balance. Balance between central power and local power.
balance between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, balance between individual freedom and social order. The greatest thing about the Constitution does not lie in each specific clause. It lies in the mechanism for it to change. It does not lock America into the 18th century. It opens a door for later generations to continue to add, amend, and improve. The Bill of Rights was only the beginning. After that came a series of other amendments, expanding civil rights to people of color, to women, to groups once left on the margins. And today, after more than 200 years, the Constitution of the United States still exists, still functions, still is the oldest Constitution still in force in the world. That is not a miracle. That is the result of vision, of wisdom, and of belief in the power of the people. Now let's try to look at the modern world. We are living in the era of artificial intelligence, of social networks, of dizzying changes in technology and society. Are the principles of 1776 and 1787 still relevant? That is a difficult question, because the world has changed so much. But remember, the fundamental principles never become outdated. The right to life, the right to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are still the common aspiration of humanity. The control of power, the mechanism of checks and balances are still necessary to prevent abuse of power. In fact, thanks to the Constitution, America has overcome many challenges that seemed impossible. The Civil War, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, the Civil Rights Movement, modern political crises. All were tested and resolved within the framework that the Constitution set out. That is the enduring strength of a system built more than 2 centuries ago. Someone once said that guns can win a battle, but only ideas can build a nation. And here, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are those immortal ideas. They not only built a nation, they built a belief, an identity, a story that hundreds of millions of Americans have, are, and will continue to write. So what do you think? Between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which document is stronger? Is it that the Declaration lit the flame, but the Constitution kept that flame from ever going out? Or is it that only the combination of both created the America of today? The answer does not only lie in history books, it lies in the heart of each person. Because history is not only the past. History is the mirror for us to look at the present and prepare for the future. If you believe that the words from these 2 documents still hold value today, if you believe that freedom and justice are still ideals worth pursuing, share your thoughts, leave a comment, tell us what you think. And before you leave, don't forget to subscribe to the U.S. History channel. Hit the notification bell. Share this video with those who love history like you, because the story of America is not only the story of yesterday, it is also the key to understanding tomorrow. 2 documents, 2 milestones, 2 immortal symbols. Together they created the United States of America. And that story still continues every day, in every person, every generation, every dream.